Tuesday, the 20th of March. Your opportunity now to put your reflections, your views of what was achieved, I put that in single quotes, as regarding Brexit, to one of the key players in the whole debate, really, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's in the studio opposite me. Jacob Rees-Mogg, before I ask you to sum up, when even the Financial Times talks about yesterday's events providing stronger assurances for business that a cliff edge exit will be avoided, understandably the Daily Mail and the Daily Sun and the Sun are very laudatory as well, and even the Times, Britain and Europe agreed to disagree 4 months ago. This would have seemed unrealistic in the extreme, but now the mood changes to one of cautious optimism. How do you reflect on all of the above? Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. It all depends on the final details of the deal. That in the transition phase, we are basically maintaining continued membership of the European Union. So instead of leaving 29th of March 2019, we're leaving on the 31st of December 2020. And there are lots of quibbles that I have about that and concerns that I have about that, but it is something that is acceptable as long as on the 1st of January 2021 we have really left. So if the end state is good, then the transition is less important. It's, in theological terms, purgatory before getting into heaven.
But some would say we've already spent quite a degree of time in purgatory. Why do we need to extend purgatory? Why didn't we roll our proverbial sleeves up and get on with it many, many months ago, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to that argument, Mr. Ferrari, that I think that we didn't really need a transition period. I think that the transition period came about because of nervousness over the end state and concerns over the ability of the EU to negotiate with us. I think, as it happens, we've negotiated faster than the cynics suggested, and that we could have done without a transition. But that argument finished some time ago, 6 months or so ago, and as we've got a transition, now the focus needs to be on the end state.
Now, the idea is that people get to call you, and they will. Final question from me for now. And I must admit, if I could do it, I would have raised a Roger Moore-style quizzical eyebrow this morning when I turned to the front page of another newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, and the second paragraph, second par, and I don't need to tell you that with your eminent late father, of course, immersed in journalism as he was, second par begins, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of a 60-strong group of Eurosceptic Tory MPs, is due to board a boat and throw fish into the river next to Parliament in protest at the alleged sellout over the fishing deal. What are you cutting on board, and what's the fish going to be? And are you wearing a yellow sou'wester?
No, am I going to change my name to Captain Haddock? I'm not throwing fish anywhere. I am not a fish thrower. I think this has got slightly out of hand, that there was a suggestion that a fishing boat should go up the Thames in a protest against the delay in leaving the common fisheries policy. But I won't be throwing fish anyway. I have a nasty feeling that if I started throwing fish, they would be brought back the wind and hit me in the face. Say, no, I'm not a fish thrower.
But sticking with words, which is your forte, have the fishermen, and I'm sure there are some fisherwomen, how the fishing industry been sold out?
I think this is a real worry. The problem is that there may be a change in the approach to fishing quotas, which will make it particularly difficult for British fishermen in the final year of membership. And this is the choke quota issue, whereby the quota will be set for a maximum of each fish, and you're not allowed discards, so that if you meet the quota in the lowest level of catch for a particular species of fish, you then can't do any more fishing, because if you catch one more of those, you're not allowed to throw it back. And that is the issue, and if we were in control ourselves, we'd be able to have different rules. So there is a fear that the last year of membership of the CFP could be potentially the worst year of membership of the CFP.
How interesting. Calls, that's what we're about. Hassan is in Slough. You're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, Hassan. Good morning to you.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning.
Morning, sir.
I am a Remainer. I'm one of the Tory Remainers. But looking back, there was propaganda on both sides. And I think one way to cut through the haze is to ask this question. Nearly 2 years on after the referendum, what predictions made by Brexiteers and Remainers have come true, and what has not materialised?
Hassan, hold on the line while Mr. Rees-Mogg goes through his memory. That's an interesting challenge, certainly, perhaps on the Remainers side. Where do you want to start?
Well, the Remainers were unwise enough to make predictions about what would happen in the event of a vote to leave, rather than what would happen once we left. So the particular flaws there were the Treasury estimates of an increase in unemployment of, I think, between 500 and 800,000 simply on a vote to leave, of the emergency budget, which would see tax rises and spending cuts, the governor of the Bank of England who said there would be a technical recession, and none of these things happened. So those are false promises that they probably knew at the time were pretty speculative.
Why did they do them, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Oh, it was part of Project Fear. That,
to bully the voter?
Of course it was. Of course it was. You see, they ran the playbook that they'd run in Scotland, which they thought had worked, whereas in my view the campaign in Scotland had put the Union at risk. That if you look at the polls in Scotland, at the beginning of the independence referendum it was 65-35 for the Union. By the end it was 55-45. I don't think voters like Project Fear. And the Brexit campaign, the Remain side, was run very much on Project Fear. As from the Brexit side, it's too early to tell because...
£350 million for the NHS. I have to put that to you.
Of course, but after we've left the European Union. And we haven't left the European Union.
You're still confident that figure could come about?
Oh, I think that figure not only could come about, but I've said many times it should come about, even though I didn't actually use that figure during the campaign. I think it's very important that politicians meet the spirit of their promises as well as the technical detail, and that when people voted to leave, they thought there would be £350 million for the NHS. And politicians do badly when they say, oh, look at the small print. On page 27, clause 3, subsection 2, we said this would only happen under very specific circumstances. I think that's good enough. I think when you put it on the side of a bus and you then win the election, whoever is then in government has to recognise that is something people voted for.
Have we got control of our... Hassan, coming back to you in a second, have we got control of our borders?
We will have control of our borders on the 1st of January 2020.
Hassan, a quick reflection from what you've heard?
Yes, and I think, Jacob, you're quite objective in your analysis. And all I can say is, from experience, one negative aspect I've actually experienced, having travelled abroad a few times over the last couple of years, is when changing currency from the pound to foreign currency, I have felt the pinch. But final point is, as a point I made to Nigel Farage and Katie Hopkins last year, I hope that the predictions that we made as Remainers are wrong.
Oh, well, thank you for that, because I'm not sure that's true of all your colleagues on the Remain side, but I think that's a really positive note for you to take, so thank you, sir.
Hassan, thanks for getting us started. To Barry in Manchester. Go ahead, Barry. You're on the radio. Good morning.
Hello there, good morning. My concern is with the border in Ireland, and that is that, but first of all, I think the British government yesterday agreed to the proposals, the three options that they agreed to in December, and they've agreed to it again yesterday, that the three options for the north of Ireland were that the British government come up with their own proposals on the border, or special status for the north of Ireland, or failing that the north would remain within the single market and basically within the EU.
All right, we're battling a bit of a bad line, but you've got your points across. Barry, I probably won't ask you for a return comment because it was a bit of an effort. I trust, Jacob, you heard enough to respond.
Yes, I did, and thank you, because it's an important part of the end settlement. The starting point is that I'm a Conservative and Unionist, and that Northern Ireland is much part of the United Kingdom, as Somerset is, where my constituency is, and that therefore Northern Ireland must not be treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. The second point to make is that we're leaving the European Union, and therefore the idea that we remain inside the single market and the customs union to have a frictionless border is absurd, because it would mean we hadn't left. And the argument put forward by the EU that Northern Ireland should remain, even if the rest of the UK doesn't, is as sensible as saying that the Republic of Ireland should join the United Kingdom single market and the EU should set its border with the Republic of Ireland. That even when you phrase that, you realise how unacceptable that is both to the European Union and to the Irish, and the EU ought to realise that the converse is just impossible for the British to accept. So you have to look at technological solutions. You have to look at ways of having open borders that are very similar to what happens currently. People forget that there is a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland for VAT purposes, for excise purposes, and for immigration purposes. And so it'll be no different. It'll just add on customs. And that is relatively straightforward if there's the political will to do it. The difficulty is that the EU does not have the political will to do it because it wants to use it as a stick to try and keep the UK in the single market. And we must just say no.
As we look around the countries that make up the great United Kingdom, there is a report that Mrs May could have problems with dissenting or even revolting Scottish MPs over the fishing deal. How robust should she be with any dissent?
Well, I think the complaint made by the Scottish Conservative MPs is a highly valid one, that it's one of the advantages of leaving the European Union. And as a unionist, I greatly welcome the opportunity for Scottish fishing, particularly. The majority of fish in British waters are actually in Scottish waters. So it'll be particularly helpful to the Scottish economy to have a regrowth of its fishing industry. And to delay that by 21 months is regrettable. I happen to think an error, and I don't think the government should have conceded on fish.
So you have sympathy with the dissent from the
Scots?
Scots?
I go further than that. I agree with them.
You agree with them?
Let's not beat about the bush.
Right. So it's tough for Mrs May then, but she can't yield now.
Well, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed.
So she should rethink.
I think on the fishing issue, the government should rethink.
Isn't that one of our mastercards to play, I read? British mastercards to play the fish. Isn't that one of our great sort of suits?
Well, our great strength is money. People have said the UK isn't prepared for no deal. The EU is even less prepared for no deal. In the event of no deal for the last 21 months of the current multi-annual financial framework, the EU's budget doesn't add up. And then they have to ask themselves, where do they stop spending? Has the EU made any plans not to build new roads in Romania or Poland? Has it made any plans to ask the Germans for a bigger contribution? It's not only the UK that has to make plans for no deal, it's the EU. And our position is pretty strong, mainly because of the money.
Let's move to other areas. Kelly's in Trowbridge. Kelly, you're on the radio. Good morning. You're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Oh, hello. Good morning, both of you.
Hello, Kelly.
Good morning.
With the large numbers of women leaving the Labour Party regarding the GRA changes, myself being one of them, and we find ourselves politically homeless, will the Conservatives consider changing their view on this? As I think you'd scoop up lots of rational voters.
For listeners who are fresh to this, just remind this is a row over, as I understand it, gender recognition, Kelly. For listeners who are coming new to the story, remind them what they have to contend with.
So it will change the current sort of gatekeeping of 2 years living as your preferred gender, and you'll be in a panel of a couple of doctors, and there's some sort of safe gatekeeping that happens, and that will effectively just be removed. So you can wake up one day, say I'm a man, and you will have all the rights of the man, or vice versa.
And Labour and lastly, your position, Labour's position on this that has upset you is?
It's very anti-women.
I see. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, the government hasn't yet come forward with any specific legislation. And I think that the point you make is a very genuine one, that there are concerns about people not necessarily using it for the purpose for which it is intended. And legislation...
So using it, what do you mean?
Using the GRA
gender
proposed law.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that you have to be very careful in changing the law about unintended consequences and what may happen that would cause problems that were not the intention of the law, and I think the government will have to bear that in mind.
So can a trans... If you had an area where you were seeking an all-female list, can a man who identifies as a woman but hasn't actually got the certificate, could she go forward, in your view?
Well, I think Jack Dramey managed to get himself selected on an all-women shortlist as an exception to the Labour Party's rules, so I think these things have never been quite as hard and fast as all that.
So you'll be relaxed about that?
Well, there aren't any all-women shortlists in the Conservative Party,
Right.
and the Labour Party runs itself the way it does. And I think it's always had a certain fluidity, depending on your influence in the party.
Kelly, a quick response from you. I sense you're closer to this than I am. Go ahead.
Well, I find myself as a Labour voter of 25 years looking for an alternative and hoping that the Conservative Party come through.
All right. Okay.
Well, you would be very welcome to join the Conservative Party.
Kelly, thank you. Shane in Huddersfield, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, Shane.
Good morning. A few moments ago I heard Jacob Rees-Mogg there say that he feels that the voters don't respond very well at all to a project fear approach. And I just wondered his views on whether he thinks, therefore, the Conservative Party are following the wrong approach in the continuing attacks on Jeremy Corbyn's character, being as though whether it's in the near future or we go out the full Parliament, we're in the run-in to another general election. Does he feel that those continued attacks on Jeremy Corbyn's character is the wrong way, and whether that matches up to Project Fear in the EU and other campaigns?
Well, Shane, I think you make an exceptionally important point, that I think we should differentiate between Mr. Corbyn as a man and Mr. Corbyn as a politician. Mr. Corbyn as a man seems to me to be honest, sincere and forthright. As a politician, he believes in everything that would be destructive to the nation. And I think we should concentrate our fire on his policies. In terms of his approach to the events in Salisbury, he would leave our country at risk, not because he is a bad man at all, but because what he fundamentally believes is dangerous to the security of the nation.
Isn't he just urging more caution, Mr. Rees-Mogg? Doesn't he just want the samples checked and Russia allowed to look at this certain alleged Novichok?
I think you're being much too sympathetic to his position. His position is essentially to give the benefit of the doubt to Russia and to raise hairs running, as his spokesman did, about our own security services, which I think is
That was the briefing regarding Iraq, you mean? Yeah.
An extraordinary thing to have done. So I think we should focus on his policy prescripts rather than on his personal traits, where I've always accepted that he is a decent man who believes in what he says. I happen to believe that what he believes is fundamentally dangerous for the nation.
When you bump into each other, how are you around?
Well, I don't know Mr. Corbyn at all well. We've said good morning to each other in the House of Commons a few times, but I couldn't pretend we were bosom pals, but we're not personally hostile to each other.
Quick response from you, Shane?
I think to say that everything he believes is destructive to the nation, and on Salisbury, I think Salisbury's a separate issue. I happen to agree that that's not really been played out the best, but other elements of the attacks on Corbyn, where character and policy blend, I think they are still very much marry up to Project Fear. He is a friend of the terrorists. He will totally crash the economy. They all sound like sound bites from both sides of the EU debate. You know, it will be the absolute destruction of this. And to describe any leader of a party that they will lead to the destruction of the country still, to me, sounds very Project Fear.
Well, I think in policy terms, economically, he is proposing policies that have failed not just in this country before, but all around the world. And you just have to look at Venezuela recently. But in terms of his association with terrorists, that's true that he was very close to sympathisers with the IRA in the 1980s and to Hamas. He believes that is a good way of achieving peace, which is not an ignoble thing to believe, but to deny that he has been close to terrorists is simply false, in my view.
Thank you for that, Shane. Max, your question in a moment. Let's get some of the email questions that are coming in. This one comes from Rachel in Bexley. There was an idea floated last week that the government would put an extra penny on national insurance solely for the National Health Service. Does Jacob Rees-Mogg agree with that?
No, I don't. The country is paying, as a percentage of GDP, broadly the highest level of tax it's paid since the 1970s, the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s. There is very little room for extra tax revenue. The way to fund the health service is to grow the economy, and by increasing the tax burden, you will not grow the economy. I also would raise questions about the wisdom of hypothecating taxes. Very often the money gets siphoned off for other purposes in the end.
Can you grow the economy quick? I mean, you are a financial man. I don't know. How long does it take to grow an economy? You're not going to get that done overnight, are you?
The economy grows if you take the right long-term economic policies. And
you recognise there is a cash crisis with the NHS?
I've been saying that I think it should get the £350 million.
Yes,
pounds.
yeah.
I mean, I'm a fiscal hawk, but the NHS needs more money. And then it's a question of where do you find that money from? Where do you find it in the short term and where do you find it in the long term? But actually we're at the state with our public expenditure where there is not new money to be found. We can't borrow anymore because borrowing is merely delayed taxation, and there is no further ability for the economy to bear further taxes. So it's therefore a question of reallocating resources from other areas, and you have to work out where it should come from. Primary target for me is the EU budget.
Which obviously could yield quite a lot of money if those figures are correct. Max is Kenneth in Dartford. Max, you're the next caller. Coming to you in a moment. Kenneth in Dartford. As a result of what nearly happened in Parsons Green and the fact he was referred to the Prevent programme, does Jacob Rees-Mogg agree the Prevent programme is no longer fit for purpose? This is, of course, the Parsons Green tube bomber you're aware of. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
The difficulty with a question of this kind is that you never know how many attacks have been stopped. There was a very chilling comment made after the Brighton bomb by the IRA, which has always stuck in the back of my mind, when the IRA spokesman said they only had to be lucky once, and that however good your prevent strategy is, however good your intelligence gathering is, they only need to get through once to have a devastating effect. And that I think it is very hard to stop every single attack, however good.
But this fellow arrives and implies to border guards that he's IS trained or IS affiliated. He's then referred to Prevent. We've not missed once, Mr. I'm so sorry. The authorities have not missed once. They've missed twice, at least.
It certainly seems a case where mistakes were made. That's absolutely right. I suppose the defence I'm trying to make for the authorities, I'm not really trying to defend them, I'm trying to put the counter-argument so that people can consider both sides, is that the authorities are looking at a very large number of people, and that in a very large number of people, one or two who you ought to stop will get through. That is always going to be the case, unfortunately.
Yes, indeed. Just to give people some background on that, I spoke to the Assistant Commissioner in charge of the counter-terror brief. You're absolutely right. There have been 10 Islamic plots and 4 far right-wing plots foiled since the beginning of last year, so that gives you an operation. There are 600 individuals actively being monitored. That's the scale of the challenge. Let's put those papers to one side and get Max in Dartford on. And your question to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, Max.
Hi, I'm a massive fan. I just want to ask, my concern is with Russia and the economic sanctions that are being talked about possibly being used, with us leaving the European Union, I know we're very economically viable in the world, but with them having the coal and the gas and the energy, not just to Europe but to us ourselves, is it wise that we put sanctions when actually, unless you're holding evidence as a government that we haven't seen, we have very little evidence to prove they were involved in the attack?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the Prime Minister is a very cautious leader. She would not have made the claims that she has made without being very convinced that we have the evidence. Inevitably, some of that is going to have to be secret as to how we have that evidence. And when I say that I have no knowledge of the secretness of it.
Or even secrecy.
Or even secrecy.
It's not often I get you on a word. I'm going to chalk that up as a win.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrari.
Secretness, yes.
And so that's the first point I'd make. The second point is that I think that Russia has put itself outside the pale of normal international relations. Its invasion of Georgia, its invasion of Ukrainian sovereign territory, its willingness to murder people in British streets. That is not how a normal nation behaves, and you can't allow that to go unnoticed, unresponded to. In terms of energy security, I've long been an advocate of hydraulic fracturing, shale gas, which we potentially have a great deal in this country, which would reduce the cost of gas in this country and make us less dependent on overseas supplies.
Yes, I doubt that there's one at the end of your garden, though. This is probably the problem, isn't it? There's people don't really want that sort of thing going on in their neighbourhoods.
Well, as it happens, my bit of Somerset is the old Somerset coalfields, and it is possible there is shale gas in North East Somerset. So,
right, you're ready to yield some of that lovely soil and turf.
The size of a hydraulic fracturing plant, bear in mind it's horizontal drilling, so you only need a very small plant above ground. It's not this great blot on the landscape that people think it might be. And when the coalfields were developed in Somerset, they became convinced that they were stopping the Bath Spa water flowing through.
Oh, right.
And the great founder of the science of geology, William Smith, was called in to investigate, and he discovered the waters had simply been blocked by an oxbone.
Wonderful historical note. Max, thank you. Let's time for one more. Sue in Croydon. Sue, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, Sue. Good morning.
Hello there. I was on the topic of paternity leave.
Oh, yes.
So my belief is on this, that unless companies really embrace it, unless there's equality in the workplace in all areas, then actually women are going to suffer because men are going to get jobs above them. People are going to select them over somebody of childbearing age. I also think there's another complication to this, which is adoption. So if you adopt a child, then you get parental leave, maternity leave.
So if I were to move you to your direct question, Sue, because we've come to the last minute or so.
Yeah.
What's your direct question of Jacob Rees-Mogg?
My direct question is, why isn't this in law?
What aspect? Why isn't what aspect in law? That people are mandated to take paternity or maternity leave, is that it?
That it's optional for both men and for women.
Oh, what, and they could trade it between the two of them? Is that the suggestion you have?
Absolutely.
I see. OK. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, there is some flexibility in paternity leave, as I understood it. I thought people could take...
Yes, fathers get the option of 12 weeks paid, I've just had put up for me, use or lose paternity leave to try and encourage greater male involvement in the young lives of children. This is from the Women and Equalities Select Committee last week.
So I think there are moves in...
You've never taken
direction.
any, have you? I remember you've talked about this once before, didn't you?
I haven't taken any paternity leave, no, but I've always been in jobs where it was easy for me to go and visit the newborn baby and so on, so it hasn't been a particular issue.
Yes.
I wouldn't in this instance take my life as necessarily a model for others, that others have different needs and requirements. So I'm not against paternity leave.
Yes.
It's just I didn't need it when my children...
Don't you think it's more important later on? I always think it's more important later on, because normally, not that I have a wife anymore, but when the children came along, it was her mum who was moved in to look after, and then normally it's probably better for Dad to come up in about a year's time or something like that.
I'm sympathetic to that view, actually. I think you want to be able to do things like go and see their school plays.
Yes.
And that becomes very important. It becomes very important as they get a bit older and they want you actually to be at things that they are doing.
Well, you must never stop seeing school plays and activities and rugby and cricket and goodness knows what else.
Well, I missed George Osborne's autumn statement several years running because it always clashed with a school play.
I think you did rather well there, didn't you? Any excuse will do. Jacob, great seeing you. Thank you. Jacob Rees-Mogg.